Welcome back. A nationally acclaimed author has written a new book about Benedict Arnold's heroics during the early years of the Revolutionary War, waging what historians say was one of the greatest naval battles in America's history, right here on Lake Champlain. For Nat Philbrick, this stop this week on his nationwide book signing tour was a homecoming. Philbrick, whose father taught at UVM, spent his early childhood and summers in Vermont. He's written several bestsellers on the whaling industry, the voyage of the Mayflower, the early days of the Revolutionary War, and now one of the most famous battles on Lake Champlain. During a talk after his book signing, Philbrick says it was his mother who convinced him to write Valiant Ambition about the rise and fall of Benedict Arnold.
Mom had very strong opinions, and one of them was that Benedict Arnold got a bum rap, that he was actually one of the best generals of the Revolution. And I'd say, Mom, you know, if someone calls me Arnold, Benedict Arnold, it's villainy personified. What are you talking about? Well, I am here before you tonight to say that Mom had it right in a lot of ways.
Philbrick's talk was a fundraiser for the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, where visitors can tour a replica of the gunboat Philadelphia. The original sank during the Battle of Valcour and then was later raised from the lake bottom and put on display at the Smithsonian. Along with underwater archaeology, finding and preserving shipwrecks like Arnold's sunken gunboat, the Spitfire, the Maritime Museum holds workshops every year for thousands of students.
We're trying to create an environment where for full weeks students become snorkeling archaeologists, lake ecologists, and adventurers and discoverers that inspire lifelong learning.
And Nat Philbrick joins us now. Welcome. Nice to see you.
It's great to be here.
You've been touring the country for book signings and talks, including this week in Burlington, as we just saw. Unlike other stops on your tour, do you find people here in northern New York and Vermont tend to view Benedict Arnold more as a war hero than as a traitor?
It's a little different here. It is, because in this location, you saw him historically in his best light. I mean, and the truth is, at that point in his career, in the early years of the Revolution, when he was up north, there was no one better. Victory after amazing performance after amazing performance.
Did you spend a lot of time here in northern New York and in Vermont researching the book?
Yeah. The Lake Champlain Maritime Museum was hugely helpful. I rented a motorboat, made my way all the way up the lake, and then went around Valcour Island many times, and trying to figure out where everything was. So, and since I learned how to sail on Lake Champlain, it was really fun to return to the old haunts.
And you mentioned that you actually spent time as a boy in Burlington.
Yeah. My dad taught at UVM, and so when I was in kindergarten, we moved to Pittsburgh, but we had a summer camp in Underhill, and when I was 16, my first job was as a counselor at a sailing day camp in Fisher's Landing there in Shalott.
So you know Lake Champlain well.
Yeah, and used to race a sunfish in Mallett's Bay and all that kind of stuff.
When you were up here researching your book, did you uncover any new revelations about either the Battle of Valcour or Arnold during that point in his career?
Well, I think the Battle of Valcour is the greatest sea battle that no one's ever heard of if you're beyond Lake Champlain. And so for me, it was the whole thing was a revelation. I can't say I found a new source that gives it in a totally new light, but for me, I write these books not because I know everything about them, but because I want to learn about them. And so for me, that whole sea battle on a lake was a real revelation.
And he didn't win. Arnold and his fleet, of course, didn't win the Battle of Valcour, but was it truly cunning the way that he outmaneuvered the British fleet and basically stalled their advance down the lake? Oh,
absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. And whether he was on the water or land, there was nobody better than Arnold in recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of an enemy. And he knows they've got this great big three-masted ship that's going to blow him out of the water if he gives them the chance. But what does he do? He hies up and behind Valcour, lets them sail past, waves, says, "Come and get me." And they have to sail upwind, and a square-rigged vessel simply can't do that.
The naval battle at Valcour Island, why was it so pivotal?
Yeah, well, Washington had lost New York to the British, and so General Howe was there. And there's this waterway going north, as all of your viewers know, the Hudson to Lake Champlain. And Before roads, that's how you got an army around. And if the Americans lost the command of that to the British, it's all over. And so if the British were able to take Fort Ticonderoga, punch over to the Hudson, take Albany, and link up with Howe, they would have it. And we would have lost the Revolution in 1776. And so you can argue that it was Arnold, the future traitor, who saved America in the very early part of the Revolution.
So after the Battle of Plattsburgh, was Arnold hailed as a hero, as a military genius?
You would have thought. But the Continental Congress, in its wisdom, and by the way, a dysfunctional Congress is nothing new, had instituted a new program for appointing major generals. And Arnold was our highest ranking brigadier with basically the best record. And he assumed after his performance at Valcour Island he would get a promotion. But the Continental Congress decided that each state would get 2 major generals, and since Connecticut, Arnold's home state, already had 2, he was overlooked for promotion, while 5 brigadier generals were elevated past him to major general. And this began his questioning, why am I doing this? My own personal finances have gone towards the cause. He had already been injured once at Quebec. My own country seems to be unappreciative of what I'm doing.
So what led then to his downfall?
Well, ultimately he would be terribly injured at the Battle of Saratoga, which you can argue that a victory largely he was responsible for, and that really messed with not only his body but his head. And then he would become increasingly disenchanted, and ultimately, he would just say, "This country is falling apart. The British have more respect for me than they do." And also, he honestly felt that there's no way the Americans were going to win. Americans were showing much more interest in fighting themselves. Let's bring in the British and restore the freedoms we had had before the Revolution had broken out.
So when did he finally decide to defect?
He decides, I'm going to try to become commander at West Point, and if I can turn that over to the British and he negotiated a very good price for it, that's what I'll do, and that will make me a hero because I will have restored peace to this war-torn land. Of course, it did not quite work out that way.
So there was a payoff for his defection.
Absolutely, and that's where, in his own mind, he thought he was doing the right thing, but it's inexcusable because he did do it for the money. And that's where it's ultimately reprehensible. He was a traitor.
Did he become an effective military leader for the British in the waning years of the war?
I mean, you could argue he was the best general on the American side and the British side. He goes down to Virginia, goes up the James River, burns Richmond to the ground. Governor Thomas Jefferson is forced to flee Monticello. And you could argue it was why Arnold was the catalyst that set into motion the movements that ultimately culminated less than a year later in the great victory at Yorktown.
As books like yours raise new awareness about Arnold, do you think it will make people more sympathetic to him?
It's interesting, because I've been going all around the country. I've been in Connecticut, where he was the local hero and villain. And I hope it will move people to realize he wasn't just a villain from the start. There's a complex story here, because I really think there's a tendency to look to the past and think it was a simpler time where people were motivated by good or evil and see it almost people in caricatures of what they were. I'm trying with my books to say, look, it is more complicated than that, and it's much more interesting than the myth many of us have grown up with.